This video is brought to you by Squarespace, from websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. As long as the Colosseum stands, so does Rome. When it falls, Rome falls, and the whole world with it. These words are attributed to the 8th century English monk, the Venerable Bede. They express how the grandiose amphitheater was seen as the embodiment of the spirit and the continuity of Rome. And yet in the 8th century, the glory days of the Colosseum were far behind. The monument had been ravaged by centuries of neglect and would suffer further pillaging, destruction, and humiliation. But luckily for us, for Rome and the world, it still stands. In today's Geographics, we're going to learn about some of the most important or curious events that took place during the Colosseum's 2,000 years of existence, starting with its glorious inauguration. On a joyous day in the year 80 AD, Romans flocked to the Via Sacra, the sacred way, to witness a procession like they'd never seen before. Legionnaires, lictors, and noble young men preceded a circus-like parade of wild and exotic animals, followed closely by the strongest and most famous gladiators of the time. This was just the opening salvo to a spectacular event offered by Emperor Titus, the grandiose inauguration of the Colosseum. Except at that time, Romans didn't call it the Colosseum, but rather the Flavian Amphitheatre. The name Colosseum was first used only in the 11th century, as the amphitheater stood next to a colossal statue of Emperor Nero. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In the early Republican period, around the 6th century BC, the area now occupied by the monument was a pond. The Romans, those indefatigable builders, drained the pond and erected houses, temples, and buildings dedicated to civil service. On the 19th of July 64 AD, a fire ravaged Rome. This is the big fire usually associated with the image of Emperor Nero callously singing as his city's devastated. But according to Tacitus, Nero devoted much of his money and energies to helping the survivors. He did take some advantage of the disaster, though. The fire destroyed many of the buildings once standing on the old pond, and Nero took the occasion to build there his new residence, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. The estate covered an area of 60 acres, graced with villas, gardens, the Colossus, the first mentioned, and a large artificial lake. Nero's death in 68 AD was followed by the unfortunate year of 4 emperors. The last one of them, Vespasian, remained in power for 10 years. He confiscated much of Nero's estate to the benefit of the city. He decapitated the Colossus, replacing Nero's face with one of Apollo. He then drained the lake, and in 71 AD he began erecting a large public building on the reclaimed land, the amphitheater that would take the name of his dynasty, the Flavians. But Vespasian died in 79 AD, so it was up to his son, the new emperor Titus, to organize the lavish inauguration ceremony. According to historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Titus offered a 100-day program of spectacular games for the joy of the Romans. Thousands of animals, including 4 elephants, battled against other beasts, men and women. Over the course of the games, some 9,000 animals were slain by the venatores, the professional hunters in the arena. The carcasses were dragged outside the theatre and dumped into the Canaria, or mass graves. When they were rediscovered in the 19th century, the stench put archaeologists out of action. Next on the menu was the favorite Roman entertainment, gladiatorial combat. The cream of the crop from the empire's gladiator schools marched into the arena, arranged according to their armament and fighting style. The lumbering giant Hoplomachii, the more agile Thraces, the Retiari armed with fishnet and trident, and their natural adversaries, the Secutores. But Titus had a rare treat in reserve for his audience. He had hired teams of gladiators fighting on horseback and even chariots. The fighters lined up by the emperor, who had the duty to test the sharpness of the weapons. Then the carnage began. Normally gladiators would have fought one-on-one duels, but on this occasion they engaged in proper staged battles, pitching one category against the other. A winning gladiator rarely killed an opponent in the heat of battle. It was more common for the loser to be disarmed or knocked to the ground. It was then up to the emperor, or rather the crowd, to decide his fate. If their lives were spared, they could exit the arena through a special gate, the Porta Sana Vivaria. If the roar of the mob demanded blood, the corpses of the fallen were attended to by slaves dressed as the Etruscan demon Charon. These apparitions finished off the gladiator with a hammer blow to the head. Then, more slaves dressed as Mercury pierced the body with grappling hooks and dragged it through another gate, the Porta Libertanesis. Inside a dedicated room, the Spoliarium, the dead fighters were stripped of all weapons and armor to be refitted for another gladiator. Sometimes slaves got away with stealing some souvenir highly prized on the black market. Even gladiator blood could be sold as a treatment for impotence or infertility. When the arena was cleared from the last drop of blood, a sated and satisfied audience was about to leave. Then something extraordinary happened. Water started to pour into the amphitheater, and soon the area became a shallow lake. Trained horses and bulls came galloping in, splashing in the water. They were soon followed by a squadron of small warships manned by gladiators dressed as sailors. Titus was being particularly generous. He was delighting his subjects with the recreation of a naval battle. This was more than a mere choreographed reenactment, as vessels rammed each other and fighters boarded enemy ships, weapon in hand. Next, it was time for the legendary Thessalian bullfighters to take the stage. Audiences gasped and cheered as they leapt barefoot on the bull's back, grabbing them by the horns and breaking their necks. Celebrations continued for 100 days, in which grotesque butchery was alternated with the refined performances of singers, dancers, and actors. Until the last day, Titus did not neglect the practical needs of the spectators. From his VIP seat, he tossed small wooden balls over the audience. Each sphere was a token which could be redeemed against food supplies, cattle, horses, gold, and even slaves. Unfortunately for his subjects, the reign of this generous emperor was short-lived. Now, if you don't want your online presence to be short-lived, you need all of the tools for a successful website. And fortunately, that's where today's sponsor, Squarespace, comes in. This really is the age of creation on the internet, and either you've got a great idea yourself, or you probably know someone who has had one and built a website or something like that. And when it's time for you to move your project from your head to reality, well, that's where Squarespace comes in. It's the perfect web tool to help you fashion the internet into whatever you want it to be. Maybe the hands-on type with lots of opinions and ideas about what exactly your website should look like. If so, that's cool. Squarespace gives you all of the customization options you could ever want, with no updates, no patches, no technical BS to worry about. Or maybe you just need something functional, something that works with minimal thought so you can stay focused on the content and not just the coat of paint. Just use one of their quick, beautiful templates to make a website that's both fresh and simple. And once you're done setting up your website, locking in the name, maybe playing with the colors, there are so many extra features that Squarespace provides so that your website can thrive. Email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support. Everything you could ever want is in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, it's got to be with Squarespace. Right now, you can go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And let's get back to it. After the death of Titus in 81 AD, his brother Domitian took over. The third Flavian emperor added the fourth story of seats to the amphitheater and dug the hypogeum, the underground chambers and galleries beneath the arena in which the shows were prepared. Those chambers were almost entirely built in wood and supported the equally wooden floor of the arena. During Domitian's time, another innovation was the velarium, a gigantic awning that covered all seating areas. A special crew of naval sailors were trained to hoist the velarium when most needed, blocking out the fierce sun or protecting crowds from the rain. As for what went on inside the arena, there was very little innovation for decades. Gladiators, venatores, and wild animals continued to charge, bite, slash, and stab at each other. This was until the 20th of September, 118 AD, when the Romans were pleasantly surprised by a novel spectacle. An entire family of Christians were to be cooked alive. Former military officer Eustace had refused to honor the pagan gods, drawing the ire of Emperor Hadrian. The ruler ordered that him, his wife, and 2 sons be thrown into the arena and mauled by lions. To the audience's surprise, the fierce cats refused to even touch them. The unflinching Hadrian ordered that the 4 Christians be locked inside the bronze statue of a bull. A pyre was lit underneath the bull as Eustace and his family were slowly roasted to death. But when their bodies were recovered, they appeared untouched by the heat. Eustace and family would be remembered as martyrs and saints. If this story sounds too close to a legend to be true, well, you're not alone. Christian scholarship agrees that it is highly unlikely that the martyrdom happened as narrated, if at all, and the legend of Eustace may have originated around the 7th century. So, were Christians actually fed to the beasts in the amphitheatre? There is widely accepted proof that Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, was dragged to Rome in chains to suffer that fate. The year was 107 AD, during the reign of Antonius Pius. In letters written during captivity, Ignatius even implored Roman Christians not to set him free, as he longed for a martyr's death, stating, "Come fire and cross and grappling with wild beasts, cuttings and mangling, wrenching of bones, breaking of limbs, crushing my whole body." But there is no evidence that Ignatius died in the largest of Rome's arenas. In fact, there is no evidence that a single Christian was ever executed inside the amphitheatre. Christians were persecuted and executed across the empire, sure, and many of them may have been slain inside theatres in the provinces, but when it came to Rome, their persecution was less arbitrary, intensive, and violent as compared to other cities. When Roman authorities did order the execution of a Christian, this usually happened by beheading on Esquiline Hill. So I'm sorry to disappoint lovers of historical fiction, but the sight of hundreds of Christians torn to pieces by lions in the Colosseum is a myth. What is more documented is the disdain that early Christians poured upon the vulgar and violent shows at the amphitheatre, and some devout pagans may have believed that their own gods had a bone to pick with the amphitheatre, which may have been struck by Jupiter himself. The Flavian Theatre was a large oval stone structure filled with timber, basically a giant brazier at risk of flaring up any minute. This is what happens on the night of the 2nd of August 217. Jupiter, god of the sky and thunder, shot one of his lightning bolts on the last story, setting on fire the wooden seats. The blaze quickly spread to the entire perimeter of the amphitheatre. Then red-hot embers landed on the arena. The large floor was next. As it was consumed by fire, it disintegrated and sunk to the level below. The flames attacked the chambers of the hypogeum, and from there it extended to the entire amphitheatre. All of Rome's 7 fire brigades, plus the sailors in charge of the Valerium, bravely fought against the inferno for days, but neither their efforts nor a violent downpour could tame this particular beast. The pride of the Flavians burned for days on end, and the fire extinguished itself only when there wasn't anything left to burn. It took 5 years to restore the building to its former glory, but additional work was completed only in 240 AD, during the reign of the teenage emperor Gordian III. 4 years later, Gordian was campaigning in Persia. Sure to score a success, he planned for a triumphal inauguration to take place at the Flavian Theatre, reminiscent of Titus's. He amassed 32 elephants, 60 lions, 10 tigers, and many more wild beasts. He even planned for 2,000 gladiators to fight in the arena. But it wasn't to be a success after all. The emperor was defeated and killed by the Persians, and his successor, Philip the Arab, took advantage of Gordian's preparations. On the 21st of April, 248, Romans celebrated the anniversary of their city's foundation with a mass slaughter of exotic animals. The amphitheatre had returned to its glory days. But less than a century later, it entered another period of crisis. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which gave Christianity reprieve from persecution. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius sanctioned Catholicism of the Nicene Creed as state religion of the empire. Gladiatorial combat did not sit well with the Christian morals, and the games at the amphitheatre suffered a decline in popularity. At the same time, the economic burden of organizing such games was becoming too heavy for the Western Roman Empire. In 399 AD, Emperor Honorius closed down the remaining gladiatorial schools. 5 years later, the Flavian Amphitheatre saw its last ever bout between trained fighters. The event was noteworthy as a monk from Asia Minor, Telemachus, rushed onto the arena and tried to interrupt the violence, separating the gladiators. The fighters complied, but the mob was not amused. Telemachus was assaulted by enraged spectators and torn to pieces. Honorius took the hint to abolish gladiator fights forever. These were the twilight years of the western half of the empire, during which Rome endured earthquakes and invasions by the Visigoths and the Vandals. Around the year 410, the amphitheatre had been completely abandoned and partially converted into a cemetery, and yet inscriptions found on the site testify that notable Roman citizens invested good money for restoration work in 417, 450, and 470. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, one senator, Athanasius, restored the floor of the arena. The revived theatre opened again its gates to Romans, now heavily reduced in numbers and demoralized by the succession of calamities. Surely they needed some amusement, mainly in the form of staged hunts pitting veneratores against animals. As the sun was setting on the jewel of the Flavians, the last show took place in 523. For centuries, the monument entered a process of degradation and decline. During the Gothic War of 535 to 553, Rome was pillaged several times by the Ostrogoths. It is believed that they removed the iron clamps reinforcing the outer walls of the amphitheatre, which damaged its structural integrity. Between then and the 11th century, the building underwent a curious metamorphosis. First, it acquired its current name, the Colosseum. Then, the internal corridors were converted for residential use. They were used as houses, small shops, even stables. Some houses could be 2 stories high, arranged in a way similar to modern-day terraces. For this conversion, we can thank the nearby church of Santa Maria Nuova. The resident religious order obtained ownership of the Colosseum, and savvy priests rented out as many properties as possible. While part of the Colosseum had become inhabited, most of the arena and the seating rows were being reclaimed by nature. They were covered in overgrown vegetation, and the monument became a sort of mini ecosystem. Centuries after the last stage massacre of beasts, packs of wolves and other wild animals roamed again in the theatre. All the while, Romans took to a practice sanctioned by local aristocracy and the church, chipping away at the monument, stealing bricks, blocks of travertine, chapiters, and even entire columns. They were converted into lime or used directly as building material for new houses, churches, and palaces. In 1084, the noble family of the Frangipanes took a shortcut. Why pilfer material from the Colosseum when you could just live inside it? Exploiting the chaos created by a Norman invasion, the Frangipanes occupied the east wing of the building and turned it into their fortress, from whence they could strike at rival families. The fortified palace inside the Colosseum switched hands until 1312, when the church took control for good. The Pope, however, did little to slow down the deterioration of the monuments, let alone restore it. The papal seat had been relocated to Avignon after all, so why bother about some Roman ruin? The Great Flavian Amphitheatre had suffered centuries of humiliation, but the worst was yet to come. On the 9th of September 1349, a mighty earthquake originating on the Apennine Mountains hit hard at the Colosseum. It wasn't the first tremor to damage the monument, but this was the big one. Weakened by centuries of pillaging and neglect, the outer ring on the south side of the theatre collapsed almost entirely, crashing down upon the nearby houses. This would be the most important and most visible wound endured by the monument. All that was left of the outer ring was an enormous pile of rubble, which was used as a quarry until the 18th century. So yes, the big earthquake and the risk of total collapse did not deter builders to flock to the ruin for cheap materials. It was reported that in 2 years alone, 1451 and 1452, builders extracted 2,522 ox carts full of marble, tuff, and travertine. Most of the material was used to build St. Peter's Basilica and to reinforce the city walls. It's a sad contradiction that during the years of the Renaissance, Italian artists funded by the church were inspired by classical antiquity, but did nothing to prevent the decline of existing monuments. In fact, during the 16th century, the Colosseum was almost totally abandoned by authorities. Its arches, corridors, seating rows were further covered by unruly vegetation or used as refuge by criminals and the outcasts of society. Pope Clement XI, elected in November of 1700, decided to put an end to the indignity. He ordered for the squatters to be evicted, for the arches and entry passages to be sealed off. So, how did he follow up this cleanup operation? Well, by soiling and smearing the Colosseum in literal filth. The energetic and pragmatic Pope needed to supply his army, and so he set up a factory of gunpowder near the Colosseum. The manufacturing of gunpowder requires potassium nitrate, which can be extracted from manure. But where was all that manure going to be stored? Well, you probably guessed it. Thanks to Clement, the Colosseum, pride of the Flavians, became a warehouse to stockpile tons of wet, warm, stinking shit. One century later, the initiative of one man kicked off the recovery and restoration of the Colosseum as a valued antiquity. His name was Carlo Fair, Antiquities Commissioner of the Papal State. In 1804, he proposed a project to remove the manure, clean up the structure, and consolidate the northeast side at risk of collapse. Fair and his team of architects set to work in the following decades, temporarily working under the Napoleonic administration from 1809 to 1814. When Pope Pius VII was reinstated after Napoleon's defeat, the pontiff was happy happy to continue funding the restoration work. To prevent further structural collapse, Pius and his successor, Leo XII, ordered for 2 huge buttresses to be erected, one on the northwest side, the other on the southeast. Both are now part of the iconic profile of the Colosseum. Ironically, while Fair and his successors were sweating their Roman backsides off to clean up the monument, many visitors from abroad were happy to enjoy its romantic, picturesque quality as an overgrown ruin. The interior of the Colosseum had become a miniature landscape, with its own microclimate favouring biodiversity, dry and warm on the south side, cool and damp in the north. In 1818, poet Percy Bysshe Shelley described lyrically how the monument was more of a landscape rather than a building. The copsewood overshadows you as you wander through its labyrinths, and the wild weeds of this climate of flowers bloom under your feet. His friend Lord Byron chipped in his Childe Harold's pilgrimage, the garland forest which the grey walls wear, like laurels on the bald first Caesar's head. The ruin attracted also the eye of painter William Turner. His 1819 painting, The Colosseum, Rome by Moonlight, depicts an almost tropical garden thriving amidst the shadows of the arena. In the 1850s, English botanist Richard Deacon took an interest to the Colosseum's flora. He identified 420 species of plants, most of them native to Italy, but some rare species were found nowhere else in Europe. Deacon had an explanation. Exotic seeds had traveled to the amphitheater on the fur and in the stomachs of the beasts exhibited during the hunts. The fauna had been brutally slain, later to be avenged by flora, taking over the work of man. But masonry was destined to triumph once more as restoration work ploughed on. In 1870, Rome was annexed to the young Kingdom of Italy, and 4 years later, the new government funded the clearing of half of the arena and the removal of rubble from the northern facade. During the 1930s, the fascist regime did not miss the opportunity to use the Colosseum as a backdrop for their rallies, as propaganda sought to revive the glory of the Roman Empire. Much effort was dedicated to modifying the surrounding area. A nearby hill, the Velia, was leveled to construct the Via del Imperio, or Empire Avenue. The new road connected Venetia Square, seat of Mussolini's office, to the Colosseum. From his balcony, the Duce could now admire the glorious amphitheater. From 1938, its arena was no longer usable for rallies. This is when archaeologist Luigi Cozzo started digging under the floor of the Colosseum to properly explore and clean up the hypogeum built by Domitian. His work was interrupted in June of 1940 due to more pressing matters: Italy's entry into World War II. During the war years, the monument was once again put to practical use, as authorities used it as an air raid shelter. Luckily, Rome was bombed only on one occasion, and the Colosseum and other landmarks were spared. During the period of the German occupation, the Wehrmacht converted it into an arms depot, a strategic target, but once more the monument was spared the ravages of war. In the post-war era and more recent years, the Colosseum has become the most visited landmark in Italy. Its popularity with tourists has never waned, and it surely received a nice boost thanks to Ridley Scott's highly inaccurate film Gladiator. During its heyday, the circular arena was, for good or for bad, a fulcrum of Roman life, the navel of the empire. Today, its future looks promising as it continues to radiate the past glory of an ancient culture. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring it. If you enjoyed it, please do click the thumbs up button below. If you'd like more stuff from me along this line, please do check out my other channel, Mega Projects. So we cover stuff like the Colosseum, Mega Projects. It's linked to below, and thank you for watching.